first of all, welcome everybody to this webinar, Translating and Connecting Worlds. But before asking our director, the director of ISEM-CNR, to say a welcome word to everybody, we would kindly ask to turn off both the camera and the microphone.
So I guess I can do.
Right. And
I mean,
please, Professor Sabatini, the floor is yours.
two pairs.
Thank you very much. Welcome all. It's a great pleasure for me as director of ISEM, Institute for the Study of the History of Mediterranean Europe, to introduce this online research seminar about translating and connected words. This seminar is organized in the frame of the ReIReS project, Research Infrastructure for Religious Studies, a community of 12 European institutions, among which ISEM, committed in building an infrastructure of knowledge. ISEM leads the work package number 7 of the project dedicated to the history of religion studies in the age of big data, developing new methodologies. Marcello Verga, former director of ISEM and actual director of the Italian Institute for the History of Modern and Contemporary Age, is the coordinator of this work package. The idea to organize a seminar about translating and connecting words originates from the observation that starting from about 1530, the Catholic missionaries working in the multilingual and multi-religious spaces in the Iberian empires and in the framework of complex missionary practices, described, learned, and translated numerous Amerindian, African, and Asian languages previously unknown to Europeans. Spanish and Portuguese were the predominant translation languages, while Latin was used for the description and drafting of grammars. Simultaneously, in the case of the American continent, the Iberian languages became dominant idioms, while along the very extensive African, Persian, and Asian coast, Portuguese was added to the Arab, Persian, Chinese, and Malayalam as one of the lingua franca spoken by numerous maritime and port communities. In the context of the Franciscan and Dominican missions, and from about 1550, also the Jesuit ones, the American continent, Spanish, became the translation language for a multiplicity of Mesoamerican and Inca languages, and from about 1565, also the languages of the Philippines. In the plural context of the Jesuit missions in Asia, Africa, and Brazil, Portuguese was the main translation language for Dravidian languages, as Tamil and Malayalam, for Indo-Aryan languages as Bengali, Chinese, Japanese, Amazonian languages as Tupi and Guarani languages, and so on. The Catholic missionaries, often in collaboration with the local communities, brought numerous and pioneering Christian catechism and doctrines, as well lexicographic, bilingual, and trilingual works, and translated for the first time classical and Christian volumes, especially in Asian languages, both in handwritten and printed form. This chapter of the history of culture is largely neglected by the historiography, even in that of science of religions. On the contrary, the history of missions in the modern era is also a history of translation between different languages and cultures. In this sense, it's a field of research that, through religious history, allow us to focus and grasp a turning point in the history of practices and of the very concept of translatability between different cultures and systems of knowledges. This seminar has been conceived among the activities of the work package by Angelo Cattaneo, with the technical support of Claudia Firino, Alexandra Lisci, and Giovanni Sini. They are all members of the personnel of ISEM, and I give to them my warmest appreciation for this, as well as I express my gratitude to Alexandra Curvelo, Linda Zampol Dortia, Anna Carolina Hosne, and Sabrina Corbellini for accepting our invitation. To them and to the audience, I wish a good time of work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Sabatini, for this welcome and introductory note. And I would kindly ask Professor Marcello Verga, the work package 7 leader on behalf of the Institute of Mediterranean History, to give us a welcome note before introducing the speakers. Thank you, Professor Verga.
Thank you, Angelo. Thank you, Gaetano, for your welcome speech. And first of all, I would like to thank all colleagues who accepted the invitation of the CNRS and ReIReS working group, which I had and I have the honor and the pleasure to lead. I confess that it's a very easy task because the members of the ReIReS group of ISEM-CNR are wonderful partners for all projects, and for me, it's a pleasure to work with them. ReIReS, the project ReIReS, supported by European project, the European Fund Horizon 2020, is a community of 12 European institutions that are building a qualified infrastructure on religious studies. The partners of the ReIReS project are 12, I said, and they are Fondazione per le Scienze Religiose di Bologna, is the leader of all members of the ReIReS project, École pratique des hautes études en France, Consiglio Nazionale delle Ricerche, Italy, University of Tübingen, Germany, University of Apeldoorn, Netherlands, Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium, University of Hamburg, Germany, University of Sofia, Bulgaria, University of Mainz, Germany, University of Warsaw, Poland, Leibniz Institut für Europäische Geschichte, Mainz, Germany, Brepols Publishers, Belgium, and REFO 500 Network is a Dutch network of research on history of religious study. ReIReS has aimed to create a research infrastructure on religious studies within the European research area. It joins 12 European research institutions working in the domain, universities, libraries, archives, academies, research institutions, and also publishing houses to improve the access of scholars from all over the world to the data, information, and the source concerning the study of the historical and the cultural influences of the plural religious heritage in the European history. ReIReS joins research activities of the partners, integrating complementary scientific skills and capabilities, and it organizes networking activities for fostering a culture of the cooperation between national research facilities, scientific communities, and other stakeholders, including, of course, policy makers. ReIReS aims to take into account the variety of the cultural heritage, legal, literacy, artistic, philosophical, and theological heritage produced by religious communities in Europe. ReIReS aims to give a specific form and identity to the field of historical religious studies, assuming a scientific perspective which is able to focus the plural European identity and the historical dynamics of the crucial regions of the world, such as the Middle East, the East boundaries of Europe, Northern Africa, Asia, and South America. The ReIReS activities aim to train a new generation of scholars grew within the leading scientific environment of the domain. ReIReS aims to have an impact both on academia and outside academia, offering innovative scientific perspectives on historical, social, political, and economic relevance of religious traditions, contributing to a stable and inclusive society It explains and implements the idea of knowledge is understanding, or knowledge prepares or contributes to understanding each other in Europe, and not only in Europe. This workshop of this afternoon marks an important step for work package 7. The title of our work package is History of Religious Studies in the Age of the Big Data, New Methodologies. Many were the challenges of the work package 7 when the project has been prepared. And I'm sure, I confess, I'm sure that not all of them have found answer in the concrete making of the research. The focus of the work package 7 was to define the role of historical religious studies in multicultural and reflexive society based on an interdisciplinary approach. The aim of the work package 7 was to make available to the scientific community a plurality of methodological sources and reflections that allow a critical approach to the history of religions that rest historical religious studies in the context of the emergencies of our societies. At the heart of the work package 7 activities are the preservation and the enhancement of historical sources and the critical reconsideration of historiographical traditions. 2, the theme of religious conflict and religious pieces in historical religious studies. 3, the cultures of rights and religions. And the work package in the last 2 years organized 2 workshops, the first held in Rome, the second in Mainz, and the work package is organizing the 3rd workshop will be held in Leuven by the end of April. We discussed in Rome the presence and the quality of religious history in history textbooks in use in some European countries, Italy, France, Holland, Netherlands, Bulgaria. In Mainz, we discussed the studies on the history of the wars and the religious peace. And in Mainz, we will discuss on religious history and history of human rights. 2 weeks ago in Milano, the working group ReIReS and I would like to thank, first of all, Patrizia Spinato and Alberto Guasco, organized the 2 meetings on the Italian situation, on the teaching of religious history and the civic education. With this afternoon meeting, our work pages, ReIReS, intends to pursue one of the objectives of its research work, to mobilize the widest range of expertise, source, resource, and the facilities of the domain of historical religious studies by analyzing a plurality of documented sources. At the center of today's debate and contribution are the archives of the religious orders in the early modern period. Sources will be analyzed that help us to reflect on the ways and the forms of the cultural cross-communication that links cultures, religion across the oceans. I am sure that I will learn much today, and I thank the rapporteurs. I thank all my colleagues of the ReIReS working group, and first of all, Angelo Cattaneo, which is the promoter of this workshop. And I repeat, I am sure that I will learn much today. And I thank, of course, the rapporteurs once again, confident that the papers will soon be published. Thank you very much. Thank you, Angelo.
Yes, for sure. Thank you, Professor Verga. Thank you, Marcello, for this very broad and deep introduction to the research infrastructure on religious studies. Thanks to the team and of ISEM, and thanks to the board of ReIReS for promoting and making this workshop possible, especially to Carla Borsma for giving her support to all this. Now, we would proceed in this way. I would just read one page, an introductory page to today's webinar, and then I will introduce our four speakers. First of all, I would like to thank them for joining this webinar and sharing with us their research. And I would like to thank also our guests. It's very stimulating to share all this with such an international and broad group of friends and scholars. So the event description. The online research seminar, Translating and Connecting Worlds, aims to highlight and analyze the paramount importance of religious archives and sources connected to the activities of religious orders, in particular of the orders engaged in early modern and modern missions, for the study of several branches of modern cultural history. Translating and Connecting Worlds was specifically conceived and designed in accomplishment with the general goals of the research infrastructure on religious studies. And as Professor Verga just recalled, to mobilize, quote, the widest range of expertise, sources, resources, and facilities in the domain of historical religious studies by opening up to users a plurality of both documents, sources, and research tools and instruments, end quote. Over the past 3 decades, a complex and highly articulated set of research projects, doctoral theses, and publications has unequivocally highlighted that both religious archives and documentation prove to be essential for the history of linguistics, the history of books and reading, the history of geography, the history of the European expansion and empires, and Orientalism, ethnography, art history, the history of cultural encounters, translation, and clashes. Altogether, these composite fields of inquiry demonstrate the great potential of religious archives, library, and sources beyond more traditional and, quotation mark, internal religious research perspectives, such as the history of religions or religious orders. Religious archives, libraries, and sources are aggregators of knowledge that preserve and mediate fundamental sources for the study of several social and cultural processes. In particular, they have a great potential to promote reflections on situations where cross-cultural communication began, worked, or broke down in early modern and modern missions. As an example, they are of particular value for understanding the processes of learning, rejecting, or imposing others' languages, sharing, negotiating, contrasting systems of beliefs, worldviews, values, histories, and memories by exchanging languages, visuality, and oral traditions. Well, in the light of these very brief introductory notes of Professor Verga and Professor Sabatini, introductory notes as well, it's my pleasure to introduce you our first speaker, Professor Alexandra Curvelo. A few lines of introduction. Alexandra Curvelo, formerly my colleague at the New University of Lisbon, holds a PhD in history of modern art from the Universidade Nova de Lisboa, New University of Lisbon. The PhD was on Namban art, so Japanese art, and its circulation between Asia and America, circa 1550 to circa 1700. She is an assistant professor at the new University of Lisbon and a member of the Art History Institute in the same university. Author of several books, chapters, and articles, including Namban Folding Screen, Masterpieces, Japan, Portugal, 17th century, published in 2016. She was the PI of the project Interactions Between Rivals, the Christian Mission and Buddhist Sects in Japan, circa 1549, circa 1647, of which I was also a member, a fellow. So thank you very much, Alexandra, for joining in this webinar. The floor is yours. You have some 20-25 minutes. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much, Angelo. It is an honor to be here and to participate in this international seminar. And I would like to start by thanking Professor Gaetano Sabatini, Professor Marcello Verga, and Professor Angelo Cattaneo, as well as all the people involved in the organization of this web seminar. And also say hello to my colleagues and to all the public here present. So I will share now my PowerPoint. Is it okay? So I will begin. The present online international research seminar aims to highlight and analyze the importance of religious archives, as already mentioned, and religious sources connected to the activities of early modern and modern missions for the study of several branches of modern cultural history. As an art historian devoted to the studying European presence in Japan in the early modern age, above all, missionaries, I assume that objects, including images, are a particular kind of sources and documents, and should be understood as active, as autonomous, and not merely as reflective. They operate as metaphors and/or as signs, symbols, and tools, and provide the basis for an understanding of the world, testifying complex social and relationships and interactions. My presentation will be centered on two objects related to the Christian mission in Japan in the second half of the 16th century and the first decades of the 17th century. They are a Namban folding screen depicting the black sheep and the Nambanjin, now in the Museum of Imperial Collections in Tokyo, or to be more precise, a detail of this painting, and a Namban Missal lectern in the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, United States. When these objects were made, the Christian mission in Japan already had at least 4 decades of experience in the territory, and above all, in the Kinai area and in the island of Kyushu. Moreover, Alessandro Valignano, as the visitor to all the Jesuit missions in Asia, had already made the first 2 of his 3 visits to Japan. And it was precisely during the first visit, which took place between 1579 and 1583, that Valignano wrote a text of paramount importance for the mission, de Advertimentos e Avisos acerca dos costumes e catangos do Japão, that can be translated as advice and notes on the costumes and habits of Japan, better known as ceremoniale. In the introduction to a chapter that he titled, Regarding the Approach You Will Adopt to Acquire and Retain Authority Dealing with the Japanese, which concerns the necessity to convey hierarchy and dignity within the Christian mission and the way it should be perceived by others, that is, the Japanese, Valignano claims the following. Because one of the main things needed in Japan for the fathers to do what they want with conversion and Christianity is to know how to deal with the Japanese in such a way that on the one hand, they have authority, and on the other hand, they use familiarity, accompanying these two things in a manner that the one does not conceal the other, but the two are joined so that both has its place. A focal point for Valignano is how Catholic priests and brothers would gain respect, consideration, and admiration in the eyes of Japan's sophisticated, complex, and hierarchic society. One of the first to understand the need to observe and learn from the ritual and ceremonies of Buddhist sects and to convey some familiarity to Japanese converts to Christianity was the Jesuit Balthasar Gago. This practice of intending Buddhist ceremonies to observe specific behaviors and apprehend the overall ambience was further explored by another Jesuit, Gaspar Vilela, one of the main missionaries responsible for the development of the cultural accommodation method in Japan. In 1565, when living in Kyoto, the oratory of a bonze at a lecture attended by Vilela left him stunned. A companion later wrote that the mission greatly benefited from the practice of listening to Buddhist lectures. And I'm here quoting Luís Frois, a letter written by Luís Frois in 1565, when he writes that Father Vilela took great advantage to this visit because he could take some teaching about how to proceed with the Christians in preaching according to the Japanese taste and language. The advantage referred to in this letter comprised not only the learning of the Japanese language, but also the study of the sermons of the bonzes, with the aim of subsequent adaptation to Catholic ritual. Valignano echoed these same ideas in the ceremonial when discussing how to obtain and maintain the so-called authority and respect when interacting with the Japanese. To maintain this authority, and I'm quoting, it matters greatly that all the church's ceremonies should be done with much reverence and outward appearance, without any pressure or haste, but slowly, just as the bonzes do, and that is why they must learn well the church formalities, giving good order to them, so there is no confusion. Valignano underlines that there could not be any misunderstanding in the process. The overall objective was to make Christian ceremony more familiar to the Japanese converts through the adaptation of some recognizable elements that would not change the Christian message and meaning. And here I'm showing a detail of a folding screen, folding screen now in the Nanban Bunkankai in Osaka. And this is, of course, a formal detail of this much deeper and profound sense that is presented in the documents and above all in the Cerimoniale by Valignano. And I'm trying to establish a parallel between this formality and with using what we can clearly identify as a type of Buddhist altar. And that's why I have chosen the Kodaiji mortuary building built in Kyoto by the widow of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Nene. So for the Christian mission in Japan, the question of communication with a broad, with a varied and audience, and not only the elite, was of paramount importance. And its efforts in mastering the Japanese language attest precisely to this priority. Likewise, the creation of a painting seminary in Japan served this same purpose. When this painting seminary emerged during the last years of the 16th century, this proficient, skilled complement to the humanistic education and the study program of the Society of Jesus soon became an additional effective tool for outreach to a wider community. Its manifold activities included the construction of visual devices, printed works, and musical instruments. And here I present a pair of folding screens with Westerns playing music, attesting also not only to the painting, but to the construction of musical instruments within the painting seminary. This is, in my view, particularly relevant because following in the steps of Mikval, it reminds us that the domains of visual and material culture are intimately associated with sense-based activities, namely looking or seeing, listening, and reading. Given that all these activities are mutually permeable, the same activities, that is listening and reading, can also have visuality in them. Hence, literature, sound, and music should not be disregarded from the object of visual culture, as the production of the painting seminary in Japan attests. At the same time, through this role, it placed itself as a space of cultural interaction and mediation among the different agents it involved and aimed to reach. From the beginning of the Christian mission in Japan, the Western missionaries noted the Japanese fondness for religious images and objects. Recognition of this natural predisposition became a convincing argument for the necessity of replacing images of local idols with a Christian repertoire, especially the image of Christ and the picture and the image of saints. So let's go to the non-unfolding screen now in the collections of the Museum of the Imperial Collections in Tokyo. I'm really sorry for the bad photograph. That's the only one I have from the whole pair, but I will focus on this detail as already said. This pair of folding screens depicting the arrival of the Black Ship and of the southern barbarians to a Japanese shore, now kept, as I said, in the Sonamaru Shozokan in Tokyo, presents this curious detail. On the right screen, we can observe a group of these foreigners, these southern barbarians, walking toward a religious compound where Western missionaries, not only Jesuits, we can identify different missionaries from different religious orders, gather around an outdoor altar. The altar, that I will explore now, presents different elements. I will call your attention to the painting, to this set of objects, and to this third object. So the curtains are pulled back to reveal its interior, and in its center we observe the image of Christ portrayed with seems a dark skin a long, dark, curly hair, a mustache, and a long beard. Although we can infer by the position of this figure that it was meant to be a Salvator Mundi, or Christ as the savior of the world, and I'm here presenting a very well-known painting from the painting seminary in Japan, attributed to Jacob Niva, and now in the General Library of Tokyo University, a painting depicting Salvator Mundi. And as I said, although we can identify this painting in the folding screen as a Salvator Mundi, the fact is that the gesture of the right hand does not convey exactly the established iconography, nor the positioning of the left hand, resting over an indistinct support and sustaining a cross. However, its identity as a Christian image leaves no doubt, as it asserts itself by the general ambience and the symbol of the cross, even though this iconography evokes similar icons of Buddhist and Taoist deities. We can observe other than the presence of Christ in this painting, probably attesting to the production at the painting seminary, the colorful Japanese architectural setting, including an altar with an array of liturgical ritual instruments and objects. The utensils depicted and the altar itself closely resemble those used in Buddhist and Shinto temples, where paintings and other elements such as textiles, incense, and ceramics play a significant part in the sacred setting as expressions of the concept and practice of shogun, which, according to Andrew Watsky, and I'm quoting, denotes adornment that proclaims and celebrates the divine. Western missionaries knew this term, shogun, which refers to a decorative setting to imbue rituals with a sense of solemnity and gravitas. It appears in the Portuguese-Japanese dictionary, the Vocabulário da Língua do Japão, published in Nagasaki in 1603. More precisely, the Mitsugu Sokko, or the Japanese Buddhism traditional arrangement of 3 articles, usually consisting of a censer, a candlestick, and a vase for flower offerings, often displayed in front of a painting of Buddha. Curiously, this term appears in the Vocabulário. Mitsugu Sokko, 3 coisas que se põem diante dos ídolos: perfumador, castiçal, vaso para pôr rosas ou flores. That is, 3 things that stand before idols: perfumer, candlesticks, and a vase to hold roses or flowers. With no equivalent in Western languages for the Japanese term involved, its translation as resplendescence or decoration denies its religious aura. Yet these pictorial compositions and the writings of the time make clear that the missionaries understood this term very well. The painting of this folding screen is sufficiently detailed for us to identify a Chinese ceramic incense burner and on an adjacent table what seems to be a monstrance or as a receptacle for the display of the consecrated host with a tomoemon, or more precisely a migi, mitsu domoe, decoration and a cross on the top. The tomoemon pattern, possibly related to water and the idea of whirlpool, typically decorates the semi-cylindrical eave and tiles of Buddhist temples and frequently Shinto shrines as well, which may indicate that it expressed the spirit of the gods. Roof tiles excavated at some Christian archaeological sites in Japan attest to the appearance of this symbol in a Christian context. One such case can be found in Nagasaki, where the Museum of the Church of Santo Domingo Church, displays examples of round eaves tiles with the pattern of tomoemon, along with tiles decorated with different variations of floral crosses. These examples remind us that for most part, objects and images have several layers of meaning, and also attest that the use and functions of these objects and images could have been multiple, and that they could take place in different cultural and religious realms. This brings me to the second object I want to discuss, a Namban lectern or shock and eye in the collection of the Peabody Essex Museum, used to support both the liturgical book containing all instructions and texts necessary for the celebration of Mass throughout the year, or the Bible itself. Missal lecterns or kendai, shoko and dai, are the most numerous group in Namban liturgical furniture, and a significant number, such as this one, bear a medallion enclosing the IHS monogram with the initials of the name of Jesus in Greek, combined with the Jesuit symbols of the Passion, such as the cross and the 3 crucifixion nails piercing the Sacred Heart, all within a radiant sunburst. This type of IHS medallion was commonly used on the title page of contemporary printed works concerned with the Christian doctrine, namely the ones printed in Japan. This exemplar is formed from 2 assembled and hinged planks of hinoki cypress, with a surface decorated with mother of pearl and gold and silver powder on a black lacquer base. The densely decorated surface is covered with Japanese foliage and flowers, with the designs framed by a band of cut mother of pearl shaped as triangles, outlined by a zigzag pattern in gold lacquer. Presenting striking formal and technical similarities with lecterns produced in Goa for the Catholic Church, this commission made in Japan thus follows a pattern that was known in different territories. However, the foldable book rest is a particular object because it is shared by different religions, namely Islam, being called Ral in Arabic, and mostly presenting an X-shaped form. The echo of an object that belongs to different religious cultures, associated with the fact that the Catholic missions in Asia interacted with Islamic communities as well, also resonates in the Peabody Museum's exemplar, as in many others objects such as this, and is mainly visible in the contour of the lower register of the lectern with its markedly Islamic design. Here we have then an object that integrates elements from at least 3 different cultural and religious realms: Catholic Europe, Buddhist Japan, and Islamic communities spread in South and Southeast Asia. Thank you very much. And okay.
So, thank you, Alexandra, for sharing these amazing images that I remember were either depicted by Japanese painters autonomously or by Japanese painters trained in the Jesuit school of painters created funded in 1583 and active until 1614, when the Jesuits were expulsed by Japan. So thank you very much for your analysis and insight. We will have time to discuss or raise more questions in the final part of our webinar. So thank you again, Alexandra. And now it would be my pleasure to invite Linda Zampol Dortia. Welcome, Linda. And a few words of presentation. Linda Zampol Dortia holds a PhD in religious studies and history from the University of Otago in New Zealand. She is an adjunct lecturer at Foscari University of Venice, where she teaches early modern Christianity in Japan. She has held research fellowships at the Center for Religious Studies of Ruhr University in Bochum, at the National Library of Australia, and at the Center for Comparative Studies of Civilizations and Spiritualities of Giorgio Cini Foundation in Venice, and also at the Center for the Humanities at the new University of Lisbon, in fact. She is a recipient, and very much our congratulations for this, of a 2020 Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellowship that she will do at Foscari University and at the Australian Catholic University as well. So congratulations, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Angelo. I would like to start thanking all the organizers of this workshop, Professor Gaetano Sabatini, Professor Marcello Verga, Angelo, of course, and Dr. Giovanni Sini, and Dottoressa Claudio Firini, that helped us with the technical aspects of it. So I will now try to share my screen and my PowerPoint presentation. So like this, share screen, share, and share. Okay, I hope it's visible. Okay, so today I wanted to make some considerations on how religious sources, and more specifically missionary sources, can contribute to the study of the history of emotions. You may know that research on emotion has been a developing field for the past 20 years. And now it is even possible to speak of a sort of emotional turn in the social sciences and humanities. However, while the connections existing between religion and feelings have received some attention by historians, Christian missions and the roles of emotions in the processes of evangelization have yet to be thoroughly explored. So today I will present a project I have been developing while I was at the Center for Comparative Studies of Civilization and Spiritualities at the Giorgio Cini Foundation, and that has become part of my Marie Curie action. The first question I would like to ask is, why should we study Jesuit missions in relation to the history of emotions? There is a certain relevance of emotions in the Jesuit so-called way of proceeding that I will talk in a second and develop in a second. But one thing that classifies Jesuit missions as a peculiar case in the history of missions is that they have produced a great amount of written sources, especially the missions, but also the Jesuit houses and organizations present in Europe. And these sources that come from Asia, in my case, have deeply influenced later European literature on Asia. Therefore, I think that together with the fact that there is a gap in the study of the history of emotions and the Jesuit missions, I think that these two reasons are excellent reasons to consider the use of emotions by Jesuits. It is generally an accepted idea in Catholicism that emotions are relevant to the person's relationship with God. Started from the early Christianity, the sensual aspect of beautiful devotional objects and liturgical textiles were thought to have a positive impact on the soul, especially for spiritual beginners. It is enough to consider the use of religious images in churches during the Middle Ages, for example, to reach the majority of the faithful who could not read. The Spiritual Exercises is a founding text of the Society of Jesus, written by Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Society. It is a guide to regulate misplaced affections and to understand how to live according to God's will. Due to its influence, most Jesuits considered understanding and shaping emotions as a spiritual endeavor. Jesuits also considered emotions as an essential part of any process of conversion. This mostly due to the example of Ignatius Loyola himself, who went through a life-changing conversion when young and left us a description of this process that was clearly connected with the spiritual exercises and therefore with emotions of the soul that were the positive emotions. Ines Jupanov highlighted how Francis Xavier, the founder of the Jesuit missions to Asia, based his missionary strategy on, and I quote, love. She writes that love is a performance enacted throughout the Jesuit Asian theater of conversion, which helped Jesuits maintain their front stage pose, even in situations in which they utterly lacked any workable socio-ethnographic knowledge or psychological skill. Xavier, indeed, exhorted his confrère to strive to be the subject of people's love and to not limit themselves to feel this divinely inspired emotion, but to act on it with the aim to be accepted more readily and thus carry out a more successful evangelization. This understanding of love, as opposed to rigor, was the seed of what would become accommodation. But what is exactly accommodation? In its widest understanding, Jesuit accommodation was based on a study of the linguistic, cultural, and religious aspects of the missionary's target country to identify the best way to carry out evangelization. As noted by Liam Brocchi, Alessandro Valignano, the famous visitor of Asia, who was a proponent of a more mature form of accommodation, explicitly identifies its main objective as the acquisition of authority among the target societies by foreign missionaries, and Alexandra has already touched upon this topic. However, Valignano returns often in his texts to the intermediate step of being loved. Through adapting to the local culture and learning local conduct rules, etiquette, the language, and to establish a good communication and obtain the local people's appreciation, and therefore to be loved and thus respected. This was a necessary condition for the evangelization message to be respected too. Regarding Jesuit sources, we have a great amount of texts still extant that came from Jesuit missions. To give an example of these many types of texts, we have correspondence, and we have here the example of the collection of letters that was printed in Évora at the end of the 16th century, and that collects most of the letters that came from Japan and China throughout the century. But we also have reports. And here I put an example of an information about an island that has been recently discovered in the northern part called Japan. This document is present in the Jesuit archive of RC in Rome. So this is an information that collects data about Japan, and we'll come back to it soon. At the same time, we also have histories of the missions that detail the adventures that the missionaries had in various countries and how the missions came to be to develop. We have missionary manuals, although not many of them in the first years. Alessandro Vallignano was particularly famous for writing many manuals and a list of rules and documents of this type. But we will also see the missionary manual later of Ippolito Desideri from Tibet. We also have catechisms or doctrines that collect the more religious aspects connected to evangelization. And as has been already mentioned, we have many dictionaries that allowed the Jesuits to communicate verbally with more efficiency with their target communities. Each of these textual genres was written for a specific audience and therefore provides the historian with information on different people that were part of the wide network of the Jesuit missions. For example, this collection from Évora was printed exactly in Europe and therefore was targeted to an European and more specifically Portuguese audience. While, for example, the Informazione at the bottom was written specifically for Francis Xavier and then was included due to the interest of the European public in different reports and informations. How is it possible to analyze these textual sources to understand the role of emotions in Jesuit missions? For my project, I will follow the approach of Monique Scheer and consider emotional scripts. Emotional scripts are part of a text that work like scripts. They provide blueprints that regulate emotions. They are relevant and specific to each culture and provide information about the role of emotions in it. Such scripts, just like theater scripts, can be performed by the reader. Intercultural communication was the basis of the accommodation strategy of the Jesuit missions. The study of emotional scripts facilitates the access to that aspect of intercultural communication that was mostly non-verbal. Indeed, emotions were considered an instantaneous communication of the soul with the divine that was a human universal. When the evangelizing message could not be communicated efficiently through words, other strategies were used. We know, for example, that a copy of Jérôme Nadal's collection of engravings of biblical images, the Evangelica Historiae Imaginis ex Ordine Evangeliorum, was used by Matteo Ricci in his Chinese mission. Another approach that was believed to be effective with everyone was through emotions. My complete project for my MSCA will consider a quite great number of Jesuit missions in Asia that you can see here. But for today, I will speak mostly about the Japanese mission, the Chinese mission, and then I will consider the mission to Tibet. So I will take into consideration texts that go from the 16th century to the 18th century. The contextual adaptation that allowed intercultural communication started necessarily with the collection of information on the target culture. For the Japanese mission, this happened when Francis Xavier received news of a land east of China, recently reached by Portuguese merchants, and we have seen the report just now. He asked one of these merchants to provide information, and later met a Japanese man who was interested in converting to Christianity. Xavier wanted to visit the country because the Japanese appeared to be people with good judgment and very curious to know both the matters of God and other of science, according to the information given to me by Portuguese men who came from this land and by some Japanese men. Japanese people are therefore characterized by the fact that they feel curiosity and wonder. This is one of the most important aspects of the emotional typology that emerges from the descriptions of their national character in these years. Xavier confirms it when he visits the Lord Ouchi Yoshitaka in the city of Yamaguchi. Xavier showed Yoshitaka a rather ornate and distinguished Bible, ancient and illuminated, and a very beautiful gloss ordinaria, new and well decorated, telling him that in those books there was the entirety of our holy law. Yoshitaka wanted to see a garment of brocade that the father carried with him, and then asked the father to wear it. It looked so well to him that he clapped his hands. The sensual aspects of the Bible and of the glossa successfully attract the Japanese, who show to be curious about them. This becomes an occasion to preach to the present people and attempt to evangelize them. The curiosity and wonder of the Japanese, however, is provoked not only by the holy images, but also by other, more mundane things brought to them by the missionaries in other instances and generally procured by the Portuguese merchants. The use of mundane objects becomes an important approach in another mission, the Chinese one. The Chinese too had been described as curious by Matteo Ricci, 16th century missionary that manned the Chinese mission for decades, often alone. Things that roused the curiosity of the Chinese people were, for example, Ricci's extraordinary memory, his mechanical clocks, he works in Chinese, Venetian glass, etc. So we can see that not only religious devotional objects are used to attract this curiosity of Chinese people and Japanese people, but also Western objects of Western making and other objects that were not common in China or Japan at the time. Human curiosity was considered a specific aid of God towards conversions. Thomas Aquinas speculated that, and I quote, wonder, that is admiration, is the best way to grab the attention of the soul. In the same vein, Descartes defined admiration as a sudden surprise of the soul, which brings it to consider with attention the objects that seem to it unusual and extraordinary. Jesuit mission José da Costa, in the second half of the 16th century, wrote that the high and eternal wisdom of the Creator uses this natural curiosity of man to communicate the light of his holy gospel to peoples who still live in the darkness of their errors. Provoking the feelings of wonder in the audience meant having a chance to overcome the barrier of their coldness towards religions, the religious and foreign matters, which was especially important in Ricci's case, as coldness too was part of the emotional typology that he had attributed to the Chinese. The initial information collected by the missionaries about their target culture often composed an emotional typology of the same target culture. Such typology, informed by the same biases that were common to all information reported by the Jesuits, formed, however, a basis for the beginning of evangelization. These typologies indeed broadly informed the policy that the Jesuits were bound to follow in each culture, especially in the case of a mission characterized by accommodation. I will now move on to a different example from the Tibetan mission. Jesuit Ippolito Desideri worked in Lhasa only from 1716 to 1721, but he left behind an extensive amount of writings composed both as evangelizing tools and as apologetic histories, written in Italian and Tibetan. Desideri's missionary policy for Tibet is contained in the final part of his Relazione and displays a complex project characterized by a global economy of salvation based on emotions. In the texts written for a Tibetan audience, such as the so-called Dawn, the central emotional connection is established between God and the catechumen, and between the catechumen and the missionary in brotherhood. In such texts, the rest of Christendom is basically absent. However, the Relazione, aimed at an European public, puts it front and center in the fight for the conversion of the world. Desideri indicates love as the key of this process. He explains that Catholic common people, in addition to donating alms, can help Asian people with their zeal. The zeal is love, and love, oh, how heartful is love in doing good. Souls are not saved only with sensational sermons. They are saved through penance. They are saved with tears. They are saved with daily sacrificial offerings. They are saved, if nothing else, with prayers. Desideri exhorts the Christians in Europe not to simply feel love towards unbelievers, but also to do love. In this sense, he quotes Xavier. Emotions as practice and their embodied qualities come to the fore in this passage, highlighting again the importance of the full-body spiritual experience of early modern Catholicism. If the Europeans cannot all be like Jesus, writes Ippolito Desideri, who resurrected Lazarus, and travel as missionaries to actively convert souls, they at least can imitate Martha and Mary Magdalene. Pray and beg Jesus to resurrect Lazarus, that is, convert all Gentiles, now accepted as brothers. They would, and I quote, in a manner of speaking, force Jesus to resurrect them with their tears and pleas. These appeals for the conversion of such atrocious sinners, as he called them, would need to go through the Son first, so that he could intercede to the Father. In return, the Europeans would receive graces and salvation too, as the souls that they helped to save would intercede for them. In Desideri's vision, therefore, all humankind becomes part of the divine plan. actors contributing in their own way in the global emotional economy of salvation. Ritual tears and emotions create a form of emotional capital that could be used to influence God, completing in this way the movement started by the divine action on human hearts that created emotions in the first place. Desideri imagined emotional community thus develops a long-distance spiritual connection between Europe and Tibet, created by various forms of spiritual love. In this affective model of conversion proposed by Desideri, geographical and spiritual distances would be overcome thanks to God's action upon the hearts of people and to divine willingness to listen to prayers, where both actions are due to love. And here I finish the presentation of my project. I thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
So, thank you, Linda, for sharing with us this your new project, and we would like to be informed about the development in this, and I hope there would be further opportunities to work together and listen more to your new reading of Jesuits, not only Jesuit, but missionary sources. And having said this, it's now time for the presentation for our third speaker, Carolina Hosne, from the National Council for Scientific Research of Argentina, CONICET. Anna Carolina Hosne is assistant researcher at the CONICET. She holds a PhD in history from the Universidad de Buenos Aires. She specializes in cultural exchanges between China, Europe, and colonial Latin America in the early modern period, global mission, history, and more recently also cultural exchanges between Europe and Tibet. So probably very much in connection with Linda Zampol Dortia. She is author of numerous articles in peer-reviewed journals, book chapters, and also of a volume, The Jesuit Missions to China and Peru. So it's a very fascinating comparison. Expectations and Appraisal of Expansionism, 1570-1610, published by Routledge in 2013. So welcome, Anna, and please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation. I want to thank Marcello, Verga, Gaetano Sabatini, Angelo, of course, and the IT team, Claudia Firino, and the other members. I'm going to activate my PowerPoint. So today I'm going to talk about the question of barbarism in the Jesuit China mission in the 16th and 17th centuries. I'm going to address some general aspects regarding the early modern Jesuit missions, this problem of barbarism in these missions, because the original plan was to talk about Spanish America and Asia, mainly China in my case, but due to time constraint, I had to narrow it down. Anyway, I thought of including some general aspects for this presentation, because when you work with colonial and non-colonial mission spaces, what I mentioned here is the weight of coloniality, citing Walter Mignolo. When analyzing European sources regarding Spanish American, even Portuguese Brazil, references of their local populations as barbarians abound. And alphabetic writing, I'm citing Stephen Greenblatt here, became a privileged technology to record these disparaging, these negative views of those populations. Then when we focus on East Asia, we find references of how the European looked up to their local inhabitants. These are very frequent references we may find. Of course, I'm talking about general trends here. Big contrast between these colonial and non-colonial mission spaces and non-colonial, especially East Asian. But the question here is what I ask myself, what happened with the missionaries, these others in non-European contexts? Could they be regarded as barbarians? And I will analyze the China mission in order to answer this question. So in terms of, I think, the idea of this research seminar, the sources we use as historians, sources we didn't think of including and using, but we are kind of forced to during our, as we conduct our research. Here I'm going to focus on two key points for this research. A question of concepts, the same concept of barbarian and European languages, whose translation from Chinese may not be commensurable with the Chinese terms referring to foreign populations. And actually, when I started this research about barbarians, I started to, there was a broader scope than Jesuit missions. It was late Ming Chinese sources. And then you see, there's a question of translation here, maybe, and barbarian, the term barbarian in European languages is very loaded. So this was one thing, one key aspect when I started this research. And the second aspect are the visual sources. I realized that this is better. I needed to resort to Chinese cartographic sources when I started.
Anna, sorry to interrupt you. We don't see the PowerPoint.
Oh, really?
Yes, we were waiting for this. Maybe try again, or please let us know if you want us to do it.
No, wait. I thought I had. So I was, but you could hear me.
Yes, very well, but we don't see your PowerPoint. You have not shared it with us.
I clicked, but maybe I didn't click.
Yeah, don't. Yes. Now you are sharing the video, but the Zoom. Yes. Now we are apparently. Yes. Now we are on the PowerPoint.
Well, sorry so much. I thought I had clicked on sharing share screen.
Yeah, no problem at all. It happens. Don't worry. So just place yourself, please, to the slides where you want to.
Yes,
to be
okay, I'm going to, so you couldn't see the PowerPoint. I started mentioning the weight of coloniality when working with two different parts of the world, colonial mission spaces and non-colonial mission spaces. And then I mentioned how the Jesuits, or I mean, not exclusively Jesuit sources, but how they would praise the inhabitants of the, what we call modern East Asia. And my focus on the missionaries themselves as others in these spaces in non-European context, if they could be regarded as barbarians, and focusing to answer this question on the China mission. I mentioned the key question of concepts, that maybe we're working with the concepts in European languages that not really necessarily commensurable with the Chinese terms. And I mentioned the, in my case, working always with archival sources or manuscript sources, I needed to include the visual sources, especially Chinese cartographic sources, to delve into this question of the so-called barbarians, especially because the Chinese had a long-standing tradition of recording foreign populations in text, but also in cartography. So the question with the concepts here is on the barbarians. I will provide some background. the origin of this term. In ancient Greece, those non-Greek populations who did not speak Greek and whose languages sounded, from a Greek point of view, like noise, like babble, like barbar. This is a very general, at the risk of being schematic, background, but it might be useful for this presentation. From the late 12th century onwards until maybe the 17th century, barbarian could be broadly applied to all non-Christian peoples. And then I quoted Anthony Pagnon here because simply the term could be used to describe all those others whose modes of life did not correspond to that of Europe. And actually, when we analyze Spanish sources of Spaniards in the Philippines, we will see these references, like referring to the Chinese language and saying it's barbarian. These aspects of different cultures the Europeans could not relate to could be regarded as barbarians. So working with Chinese sources, I'm going to provide some background here with the character E that has been translated as barbarian. This is a problematic translation, but it's a translation we may find is very contested in academia now. We're not going to find in the recent works or maybe works from 2 decades, but we still see it. And it is a translation operation that gives a false impression of commensurability between these 2 terms, E as barbarian, and I'm quoting Lydia Liu in a book she wrote, in which I'm going to show you this book, The Clash of Empires, the Invention of China in Modern World Making, where Liu analyzes this E. She defines it as a super sign, which offers a facade of perfect commensurability, forcing E into signifying barbarian as it invades the Chinese language. This is analyzed in the context of the British presence in Qing China. We're talking about mid-19th century, and the British complain about this term. There's the Treaties of Tianjin in 1858. There's a ban on this term because the British said it was a very derogatory way the Chinese used to refer to foreigners. It is true, it can be derogatory, can have negative connotations. And Liu says the Jesuits in China would have never been called E. But this is debatable, as I'm going to show here, even if these well-learned men from the West, these scholars who composed very sophisticated works in different fields of knowledge, could be regarded as E as well. I'm going to talk about that later. Another thing that we have when we're dealing with concepts and how to translate them is that in European languages, barbarian is the translation for many terms in the Chinese language. You have not only E, but you have a man, Ti, Hu, and Fan, different characters that when translated, they're like unified in this very global category of barbarian. So about these barbarians in China, I'm going to provide some context here as well. We're going to find in pre-imperial China, in texts from pre-imperial China, the barbarians usually translated Si, the 2 characters you see after barbarian of the 4 corners, referring to foreign populations in the 4 directions, surrounding Zhongguo, which is the modern name for China. Back then, the central states of the Zhou dynasty. So, because if we talk about barbarians, we're always thinking of really peripheral populations. There's a center. This center is Zhongguo, the central states, which throughout, time changed its geography, but the concept remained. And So these are a hierarchical relationship with the vassal states surrounding it. And its inhabitants consider themselves the Xia Hua or Huaxia, which is what we would call today Chinese. And we have these two, this dichotomy here, the Huai dichotomy, which is, we can find it in Chinese cartography. This is like a leitmotif. We are going to find it in different texts for different periods in Chinese history, and we're going to find it in maps too. Here's one of the first, the Huai tool, the map of China and the foreign regions, which is carved in stone. Okay, it's very detailed. You cannot see that very clearly, but here, this is a map from the Song Dynasty, where you can see here, this is the foreign populations, the north, the south, the east, and the west. And here I circle in blue, for instance, Japan, just to a reference of who could be these Eastern barbarians, always using inverted commas. Talking about the E concept, when I read this book by Liu, she mentions that the British complain about this term being applied to them in the mid-19th century, but I thought that maybe they complain about the name E, but I thought that maybe Europeans had translated that character into as barbarian before before mid-19th century. And so looking at dictionaries, I found a dictionary, Chinese-Spanish, by the Dominican Francisco Diaz in Fujian, in the National Library in France, where you can see this is very small. It's a microfilm. It's not a very good photo. Sorry for that, but you can see here there's an arrow pointing at the character E and translated an ordinary thing, barbarian man or foreigner. In Spanish, es cosa ordinaria, bárbaro o extranjero. So it was the missionaries who forced this character to signify barbarian. So we focus on the Jesuits now in China, the China mission, and their efforts, as I say here, to they would avoid being regarded as E in every possible way. So Jesuit Ricci, as soon as he arrived in China, they found a Chinese residence in Chongqing in Guangdong province in 1583. And soon after, he started to compose maps, war maps. So right from the beginning, he mentioned he's aware of how the Chinese would refer to other foreign populations, maybe in a derogatory way. So he's aware of how useful cartography could be to show them they were not E. So he says, I quote, "For all those things," he refers to cartographical knowledge here, "and known to them, the father," speaking in the third person, "provided such clear explanations that nobody could deny that all that he said was true, and that is why in a pretty short period of time, all these things were transmitted to the Chinese literati. For what it can be inferred, the gain this all meant to us and our entire land, to which they would not dare call it barbarian, as they call all the others outside China." So, well, here I'm obliged to show you this, the last edition of Ricci's war map, organized in 6 panels. This is a University of Minnesota. They own a copy of this map. This is courtesy of the University of Minnesota Library. This is the last edition of the map. There's another aspect actually interesting when we see how the Jesuits perceived which things needed to be done in order to avoid being called barbarians. And one important thing is this idea of adaptation, the so-called accommodation in the Jesuit missions, but it also had to do with this will of adapting to Chinese culture. So actually, right from the beginning, in a letter to his confrere, Giulio Fuligati, Ricci says that, referring to your paternity and the general of the General Father of the Society of Jesus, will by now know that in terms of garments, greeting ceremonies, and all that related to the external appearance, we became Chinese. Ci siamo fatti cinesi. So there's knowledge production maps, specifically in this case, and cultural adaptation. And despite their efforts, the question is, could these men of letters still be regarded as seen by the Chinese? And the answer is yes. We have to focus now on the Nanjing anti-Christian persecution of 1616. It was initiated by the acting minister of the Board of Rights, Shen Jue, who wrote a series of memorials recording this persecution. And the most important source to analyze this event is a Poshechi. It's a collection of documents which they include this persecution in Nanjing, and there you can find also these memorials, all the documents issued by the Minister of the Board of Rights. And also there's another source, which are the inventories from the Jesuits' Nanjing residence. Because once the imperial edict of expulsion of the missionaries was issued, the missionaries were arrested and the house was thoroughly searched. And the search yielded to inventories. This is analyzed in depth by scholar Adrian Dudding in Louvain University. So we have different references to the Jesuits being called very, very negative. We will find, for instance, how through their teachings they created chaos in China. And here well, this is taking from the inventories that Dudding reproduced. One of the problems was the making of astronomical instruments, because that would, according to the Chinese, was against the law. This, of course, was related to the reform of the calendar. That's another story. But the thing is that this, the private hiding of astronomical instruments, that was against the law. They says this barbarian here, the red line on the right says these barbarians came from afar and Navali took the right to fabricate them. Therefore, they violated our laws, even to the point that they commissioned the construction of these instruments in various houses of the gentry. Here, I also, on the left, there's a red line, smaller, you see, Huxiang, which is what I said. We have different Chinese terms to refer to foreign people. In this case, it refers to foreign objects of the Jesuits, of the Jesuit residents. So, but on the other page, we see E. So we have a rich terminology here to refer to foreign populations, as I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to move on to concluding remarks. The Jesuits in China experienced situations in which they were called or regarded as a term that could have negative implications for foreigners. And it had been forced to signify barbarians by Europeans in mid-China. This is what I talked about earlier. This is a problem of commensurability because the term barbarian in European languages is very loaded. So E was forced to signify barbarian, but this translation nowadays is really, it's really ruled out in academia. The missionaries took cultural assimilation as far as becoming Chinese, aiming to avoid being called barbarians in every possible way. Jesuit cartography at the beginning became a means to counteract those possible negative views. In the case of Jesuits in the Nanjing anti-Christian persecution, highly regarded men of letters like the missionaries showed that the term E could be used in very, my conclusion is that this term could apply to the Jesuits in a hostile scenario like this one, with official authorities involved, not of course the sophisticated works they would write in classical Chinese, but maybe hostile scenarios. And they were called E in the quality of missionaries whose teachings were not controlled by the state, but not because of their highly regarded activities and works in a Chinese letter culture. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Anna, for this very insightful presentation. Thank you for reversing the perspective and framing Jesuit cartographic activities within this very Chinese debate over barbarism. It's a quite insightful perspective. Thank you so much for this. And now it will be my time to deliver the final presentation before the final discussion. And I would kindly ask Professor Sabrina Corbellini to read just a few words of introduction for myself before I take the floor. Thank you very much, Sabrina.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Angelo. It will be my turn to thank you all, but now I'm taking my role of introducing Angelo Cattaneo. Angelo Cattaneo is a fellow of the National Research Council, based as ISEM, as we heard, the Istituto di Storia dell'Europa Mediterranea. And his research revolves around two main research lines, spanning from a very long to a very long durée research line, spanning from the 13th to the 17th century. The first of the research line is the cultural consideration of space, studying cosmography, cartography, travel literature, and the spatiality of world languages and religion. And the second one is the study of cultural encounters at the interface of the European and particularly Portuguese and Asian empires, with a focus on Catholic missions and trade. And Angelo was one of the coordinators of the project Interactions Between Rivals, the Christian Mission and the Buddhist sects in Japan, and PI of the SEED research project, the space of languages, mapping African, Amerindian, and Asian languages through Portuguese in early modernity. Angelo, the floor is to you.
Well, thank you so much. Can you confirm me that you see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, we see your PowerPoint.
Okay, thank you so much. So, during the 13th and 14th centuries, Dominican and Franciscan missionaries and merchants left written accounts of their voyages to the Far East, to Mongolia, China, Indochina, and India. The most notable ones include the Historia Mongolorum by Giovanni di Pian di Carpiti, 1247, the extensive report about the Mongols by Guillaume de Robruck, 1255, the letters of John of Montecorvino sent to Peking in the first 3 decades of the 14th century, and the Relatio of Odorico da Pordenone, 1330. In a worldview shaped by medieval Christianity, it is through their reports and Marco Polo's famous Livre des Merveilles, made public around 1300, that a new geography of Asia became available to the Christian West. For Martin Waldseemüller, one of the most important cartographers of the beginning of the 16th century, renowned for having named America, the southern part of the Mundus Novus, the New World, as a tribute to the Florentine Amerigo Vespucci, Manji and Katai, corresponding to today's China and Mongolia, were considered to be part of the Mundus Novus, that is, the portion of the earth unknown to the ancients, together with the islands and lands discovered or reached by Columbus, Vespucci, and many other European navigators. Although very rich in content, these medieval missionary reports about these new people and places in the Far East provide scattered information about the diversity and plurality of languages encountered. Languages that were not able to fit into the linguistic space of the Greco-Roman ecumene were defined as self-contained languages, or lingue di per sé, or lingue per sé, as they were not associated to any known language of the agents, merchants, and missionaries involved. Following a similar intellectual model, all religions and systems of belief that did not fit into the Christian, Judaic, Islamic, and pagan cults of antiquity were simply defined as idolatries. Let me share a few examples taken from the Livre des Merveilles of Marco Polo in Ramusio 1559 edition published in Venice. Chapter 28 of the castle named Taikan in the province of Skassen in nowadays Afghanistan. During a journey of 3 days, you reach a town named Skassen. The people of this country have their self-contained language, linguaggio da per sé. Or again, in Badakhshan, again, still in Afghanistan. In the province of Badakhshan, the people are Mahometans and have a self-contained language, lingua per sé. Finally, chapter 50 on the province of Basha. The province of Basha, in the province of Basha, the people of which have a self-contained language, they worship idols. Well, these are just 3 examples, but there are at least 32 such examples can be easily traced in Marco Polo's book, as well as in William de Roybrook or Giovanni di Piandelcarpine reports, medieval reports. Since the mid-15th century, the global maritime projection of the European powers bore the potential to shatter worldviews and radically altered existing epistemic frameworks, taxonomies, and knowledge networks. In this regard, historiography has mostly been concerned with the construction and the new geographical, cartographical, commercial, political space, overlooking that other forms of spatiality were produced in the troubled past of conquest, colonialism, religious proselytism, and global trade. In particular, since circa 1540 onwards, the growth of the Iberian empires and the development of missionary practices marked the start of broad and path-breaking processes of accumulation, spread, and systematization of knowledge of languages unknown or ignored by Europeans until the age of the European expansion. From circa 1540 onwards, hundreds of descriptions, word lists, dictionaries, grammars, doctrines, catechism, and European books edited in Amerindian, African, and Asian languages were developed mostly by missionaries and quite occasionally by laymen. It is in the plural context of early modern missions and by mostly using Spanish and Portuguese as translational languages, these documents first described and interpreted several Amerindian, African, and Asian languages. These events marked the foundation of the modern global system of connected languages. The three projects or research projects you see on the screen, in which I collaborated with several colleagues, brought me to focus on the need and opportunity to trace an historical map of contacts of languages and the emergence of multilingual spaces, communities, and identities worldwide in the troubled past of European colonialism and mission through the lens of the uses and functions of the Portuguese language, therefore focusing on the hemisphere comprised into the so-called meridian of Tordesillas and Zaragoza that we just saw a few slides before. All major cultural exchanges in history involved translation. So describe Peter Burke and Ronnie Shah in a very influential book, The Seminal Relevance of Cultural Translations. Among these epochal cultural translations, the early modern ones based on Portuguese as translational language have largely been ignored. I would like to call your attention at this regard on three essential phenomena. First, in the context of early modern religious missions, in particular, but not exclusively of the Jesuits, Portuguese became the translational language for several Amerindian, African, and Asian languages unknown to Europeans until the age of expansions. Portuguese became a lingua franca, so translational language on the one hand, and lingua franca on the other hand. It's a totally different language dynamic, used by multilingual European and non-European merchants, communities, travelers, and missionaries from Brazil to African and Asian coast territories, well beyond the spatiality and temporality of the Portuguese imperial presence. Finally, the impact of this phenomena is evidenced by the production of hundreds of reports and descriptions, including word lists, dictionaries, and grammars, mostly compiled by missionaries, in particular the Jesuits, and occasionally by laymen and travelers. Quite surprisingly, these sources remain scattered and understudied by cultural historians, in spite of their relevance and the pioneering works carried out by the scholars active in a recent branch of linguistics called missionary linguistics. We can remember Otto Schwarz's, Cristina Altman, Gonzalo Fernandes, Hugo Cardoso, Cristina Muru in Italy. But they are linguists. The call is for a cultural history of these linguistic dynamics and phenomena. And after these introductory remarks, I would like to look at the sources and at these documents, organizing them into a spatial and chronological order. We will begin from India. 1554, printed in Lisbon, a cartilha que contém brevemente o que todo cristão deve aprender para a sua salvação e que o rei João III mandou imprimir em língua Tamil e português, com a declaração, the pronunciation of Tamil, written above in red, por cima de vermelho. We will translate carefully the title later on. 1565. This time, a Christian doctrine in Tamil, printed in Kollam, close to Madurai, so already printed in India. 1579, another Christian doctrine, translated again in Tamil, printed in Cochin, nowadays Kochi, in India, in 1579, I was saying. I would like now to show you this 1554 document, which is, and to do this, first of all, we translate the title. Cartiglia, what is a cartiglia? It's a graded reader. That is a book used for teaching people to read or to learn a foreign language by reading. That, and I translate again, that contains briefly what all Christians should learn for their salvation, which was sent to be printed on order of our King John III in both Portuguese and Tamil, with the pronunciation of Tamil printed in red above the Portuguese. So, and now we have a look at it. This is the first metalinguistic document displaying a European language, the Latin alphabet, through the Portuguese, together with the Romanization of Tamil language. And please read it with me. So the central line is the pregunta, which is in Tamil, pregunta, vi nascareño. And in red above, following the syntactical order of Tamil, vos Christaus sois, you Christians are, and then in the third line, vos sois Christaus, so the correct, in English, are you Christians, so the correct syntactical order of Portuguese. And then, nare zambira, nare nanifiaia, which means, sing per la grazia de Deus, yes, for God's grace. In both versions, the syntactical correct one and the one mirroring the Tamil. So this is the first metalinguistic document displaying this contact among people and languages through the Tamil. Of course, this cartiglia is composed and printed so that it can be used by missionaries and catechists, even if they didn't know the Tamil language, as well as by local catechists who did not know the Portuguese language. So this mise-en-page displays well the pedagogic goal of catechism for interlocutors who ignored each other's language. They could understand one the other through the integration of Romanization, phonetic writing, and oral languages. We will see also later printed editions, 1622, printed in the Jesuit college in Rachol, near Goa, where the first ever Jesuit book displaying the Jesuit monogram was printed in 1556. So well before the printed edition of the Jesuit in Europe, a Christian doctrine in the vernacular Brahmanic language. And then another in 1632, printed again in vernacular Brahman language in Rachol. Finally, in 1640, an arte da lingua canarim, that is, a printed grammar of this language. And finally, in 1679, after more than a century, a Tamil vocabulary translated into Portuguese with some 16,000 entries. The result credited to Father Anton de Proenças, Antão de Proença, but resulting from at least 100 years of aggregation of knowledge about language in that area, in central and southern India. We move to another area, China, Japan, and also later Vietnam. 1578, Macau on the Pearl Gulf, near nowadays Canton and Hong Kong, of course. A Dicionário Português-Chinês with 6,500 entries. It's a manuscript document attributed not unanimously to Michele Ruggeri and Matteo Ricci. And then 1595, a printed dictionary in 3 languages developed in Amakusa, some 4 hours far from Nagasaki in the Kyushu in Japan, displaying Latin, Portuguese, and Japanese, a printed document with some 27,000 entries. And then in 2003, a Japanese Portuguese vocabulary with 32 printed 1,000 entries constructed in Nagasaki after some 50 years of language accumulation or linguistic accumulation in Japan by the Jesuits and their more numerous Japanese acolytes and collaborators. I would like to display to you some of these documents. This on the screen I consider it the first metalinguistic document displaying the Latin alphabet through the Portuguese language and the two systems of writing of Japan, the Chinese logographic characters and the syllabic phonetic alphabet called hiragana. It's a letter originally written by Baltasar Gago. Baltasar Gago was already referred to by Alexandra Curvelo. And this letter was later printed in Coimbra in 1570. All the signs, all the scripts are consistent. What you see there is the first attempt to display that Japanese could be written using two different systems of signs. And for those of you who have never attempted at learning Chinese or Japanese, look, you can see Lua, Moon, Tsuki, and you have either the hiragana and then the logographic character, Heaven, Temu, and again, the two systems, and then Homen, Hito. And I think that you can easily remember, even if you are not trained or even if you have never attempted at learning these languages, you can remember these signs and you can make them yours. And again, it's the first such metalinguistic document. It's a kind of Rosetta Stone for Chinese and Japanese. I will move now to another kind of Rosetta Stone. The Portuguese Chinese dictionary, and it is held at the Archivum Romanum Societatis Jesu, so it's in Rome in the Jesuit archive, and it is published by the Biblioteca Nacional in Lisbon, so the National Library of Lisbon, and it's a pleasure to display you the way it is organized. On the first column, you have the Portuguese, a Portuguese list of words based on a Portuguese dictionary published in 1579. Then you have the Chinese romanization, then the Chinese logographic character, and then from time to time, the Italian translation. So you can see them there, abano, which means fan in Portuguese, Shenxi in Chinese, then the Chinese logographic character, and then you have Ventaglio, the Italian translation. I would display to you the frontispiece of the Dictionarium with a magnificent title in Latin. There is no time to translate it now, but if you are interested, we could do it later together. And the vocabulario, this is an amazing, it's a Japanese vocabulary with a Portuguese translation. 32,000 lemmata with some 120,000 context of use of the Japanese language. Nagasaki, 1603, printed. I mean, we have to remember that the first dictionary of the printed dictionary of the Italian language, the dictionary of the Crusca or the Crusca dictionary, was only printed in 1612. Here we are in Nagasaki, and we have such an amazing aggregation of linguistic knowledge between Portuguese and Japanese. We move now to another area, Brazil. So we were in Japan, now we move to the other hemisphere, a later kind of chronology. But I would like to call your attention on the same date, 1595, for the first grammar of the language, of the general language of it's Tupinambá in Brazil, printed again by let's say on behalf of the Society of Jesus. 1618, a catechism in the lingua brasilica, in the Brazilic language. Circa 1620, another arte da língua, it means another printed grammar, printed in Lisbon by Manuel da Silva. Finally, in 1621, a vocabulary of the Brazilian language. It's a manuscript with some 5,000 entries. We have also later linguistic documents for the Kingdom of Congo, for the Kingdom of Angola, and also, and it's a much later document, for the language, a language, maybe a dead language called Lingua Mina, that was used in Africa, that originated from Africa, but was in fact used in the region of Minas Gerais in Brazil by the local community of slaves working in the gold extraction. We also have such dictionaries and grammars for languages spoken in other parts of South America that mostly pertained to the so-called Spanish hemisphere. And we have such dictionaries of the lingua aymara and grammars of languages, of general languages of Peru. Now, if we put together all these language dynamics, we could see this could be a map in which we see the use of Portuguese as a translational language and their dates within the so-called Portuguese hemisphere between, roughly speaking, 1550 to the mid-18th century. Now, what do linguists see when study or have studied this kind of linguistic contacts? I was helped to draw this kind of several mapping in order to establish a connection between people, language, identities, and communities. And in this case, this is the space entangled by one of the sources that we have taken into consideration, the Portuguese-Chinese dictionary. This is instead the space entangled or encompassed by this vocabulary of the Japanese and Portuguese languages, involving communities in the Kyushu, in Nagasaki, Oita, Makusan, and also Kyoto. 1621, this is the space encompassing the language dynamics and the people involved with them. If we take the consideration of the vocabulario da língua brasílica, so the vocabulary of the Brazilian language. 1650, the same thing for the Hanoi Tonkin region, in which the Japanese Portuguese Latin dictionary was used as a base to add the translation, the vernacular translation of Vietnamese in a document, in a printed document realized in Rome and attributed to Alexander the Jesuit, Alexander the Rhodes, who collected the work of decades of work, excuse me, the repetition of his brother in Vietnam. And finally, this is the space related to the linguistic or the language dynamics involving Portuguese and Tamil in southern India. And this is finally, I would say, these are the spaces connected through the translation of the lingua, the Mina language originating in the area of San Jorge da Mina, and in fact spoken in Ouro Preto in Brazil by the slaves living in Ouro Preto in Brazil. Now, if these biunivocal images are those normally studied or taken into consideration by linguists, cultural historians could see the whole picture. The whole picture encompassing a whole system of language dynamics and encounters involving a European language, Portuguese, with Tupi, Mina language, Tamil, Vietnamese, Chinese, Japanese, involving very different social, political, and economic kind of relationship between European communities and local communities, in which the grade of symmetry and asymmetry changed from the imposition of language, the willingness to learn languages or to reject languages, in which the missions were extremely successful or the missions were extremely unsuccessful, as in the case of Japan. Overall, all in all, I think that this vast corpora of documents and knowledge not only should be taken into consideration, even in the domain, of course, of cultural history, but of religious studies, as fundamental examples through which cross-cultural interactions in all their shades, cooperative, clashes, how to say, positive interactions, very harsh interactions, could be understood, deciphered, and analyzed. I would stop here. Thank you for your attention. So, thank you for your attention, and we move now to the final part of this webinar, and it would be my pleasure to introduce you to Sabrina Corbellini, our discussant. Sabrina Corbellini is a Rosalind Franklin Fellow and Professor of History of Reading in Pre-Modern Europe at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. She specializes in the reconstruction and study of religious reading activities in pre-modern Europe, in particular during the long 15th century. Since 2015, she coordinates the research project Cities of Readers, Religious Literacies in the Long 15th Century. Since 2017, together with Wim François, the University of Louvain, she also leads the project In Reader Hands, Early Modern Dutch Bibles from a User Perspective. Please, Sabrina, the floor is to you for your discussion. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much, Angelo, for your very kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers, to the ISEM, and to, of course, my thanks to the speakers of today for this amazing, very, very interesting lecture. So now my task, and I'm sorry to say it's quite a daunting task, is to well, to draw some general lines and hopefully to give some ideas in order to start a discussion. As Angelo has said, I'm not an expert in translating and connecting words. Well, of course, I mean, I work mostly on European sources, although Angelo convinced me of the importance of, you know, enlarging my research horizons. So thanks to Angelo for giving me this opportunity. As I said, I mainly focus on European sources, but I think that I would like to share with you some thoughts, especially during my experience on the history of reading, which I very much describe indeed as a way to translate and connect several words. So during these very, very interesting lectures, I'm noting some keywords, and I will try to work from these keywords in order to, if I may, try to summarize, to give some ideas for a more general discussion. I guess there will be participants who know much more about these sources, but a few thoughts from my side. First of all, I think that if you can say that, we're thinking about the introduction by Marcello, Verga and Gaetano Sabatini. All these papers are very much in line with the main aims of the research project, which is, I quote from the presentations, very much to focus on a plurality of methodological approaches, which is exactly what we heard from all the speakers. A critical reconsideration of the same methodological approaches, and also, and I think that all papers showed that in a wonderful way, about the plurality of documentary sources, and I would add about the variety of sources altogether. So starting, let's say, from textual sources, but also, even in this case of textual sources, in a broad variety of textual sources, lexicographical sources, diaries, experiences, manuals, catechetical texts, so a very, very broad variety of sources, to visual sources, material sources, cartographic sources. So showing that if we, as cultural historians, and that's the way I would like to describe myself, more generally speaking, really want to study and to engage in a reconstruction of translating and connecting words, especially in a global perspective, which is we're now doing now to broaden up our research horizon, even from Europe to really to go to a global scale. I think one of the most important things is really to assess the broad variety of sources at our disposal in order to be able to grasp the potential of focusing on translating and connecting words. I think it will be very limited to study global connection, just focusing on, let's say, what I call traditional textual sources, which is the one I'm studying because I'm especially on books and reading, and really to broaden up this horizon, going from Namban screens to lexicographical sources, to visual sources, to material sources, so all kinds of possibilities offered by the wonderful papers, and I have to say wonderful PowerPoints. It was a pleasure to really to see them, the visuality, the way that you could really represent this broad variety of methodological approaches. I think that if I may summarize all the papers, and that would be my first point, is the importance of communication. So the moment that you think about in terms of translating and connecting words, you are actually working on communication, which is, I think, is the word used by every one of the speakers this afternoon. All the sources, all the approaches, all the agents named in the papers are essentially trying to establish a communication. And I would say is communication studies in a very broad and cultural way. And also when we think about communication, I think we can also think in terms of harmony and conflict models. Most of the papers are very much, let's say, harmonical in the sense that was successful communication, moment that a kind of reciprocal engagement, although we're still very much, we say, focusing, let's say, from the European side, if I may say so, of trying to establish a communication, try to establish a kind of harmonical relations and a successful communication with the other. Although, as we have also seen in Anna's paper, this, let's say, successful communication sometimes was much more problematic that some of the sources could show us. Because indeed there was this idea of communicating with a barbarian, let's say, to a certain extent, from both ways. So how to successfully communicate with someone which is different, which is the other. This idea of otherness, which has been, let's say, one of the main themes for a very long time in history, and now seems to somehow have lost some of the attention. But of course, it's still there. Call it other, call it barbarian. Sometimes also works as a mirror, someone else helping us to redefine our identity, but also how this identity were actually transformed in order to pursue this communication. As I said, many of the example and the sources shown by the speakers are very much, showing the possibilities of communication, of overcoming this otherness, overcoming this distance, which is a geographical distance, is a distance in languages, is also a distance in the way of using the same symbolic language, but also this idea of, how to avoid to be considered the other, how to avoid to be considered barbarians, and not being able of pursue in this task for the entirety, let's say, of the presence, of the wish presence of the Jesuit. For example, in China, it's also this debate: who are the others and who are the barbarians? Thinking about the sources, I think that what became very clear is that the most successful way to engage in this research on translating and connecting words is the multidisciplinarity, and also I would say the multiplicity of sources, and the importance of combining, as I said, textual sources, visual sources, and also referring to Angelo's paper, how much of these textual sources should be studied as visual sources. And I mean, I was very privileged because I'd seen these dictionaries before. The idea really of organizing this very complex, what I always call this very complex architecture of the page. So the visualization of the languages actually intermingled, but being also in a kind of, let's say, list, also a kind of levels of importance. Where do you start? Which language do you put first? The use of colors, you use it printed in red in order to somehow trigger the attention. So even textual sources are very much visual sources and should be studied as visual sources. As I said, as Alexandra showed, the importance of material culture, this conflation of different horizon into the use of sources. Cartographic sources are there, the issue, and also very much the use of visual sources, not just, let's say, next to textuality, but as a primary models of communication. So as Alexandra said, I'm quoting you if I understand it good, organizing painting seminaries as, you know, teaching how to paint and to reproduce and to visualize knowledge in order to communicate. One other important thing, I think, is the idea of accommodation, which has been also, I think, used by nearly all speakers. So how actually to somehow adjust, let's say, models and contents, and in this case, very often also religious contents, in order to make this communication possible. I also would like to stress the importance of terminology, would also be how to name languages, for example, which terminology, which kind of concept do you use in order to call the other, to describe other languages, lingua per se, the importance of giving a name in order also to grasp them. On the one hand, recognizing that you have this issue of otherness, so something is outside you, but also the need to somehow to take this back to a system which is known, which is digestible, which can be somehow organized also according to models that are known, so they can be approached, let's say, from a European perspective. Also their terminology, in the sense that Anna Carolina explained to us how to introduce this concept of barbarians, and word counts, the way that you name things is extremely important, just the way you depict them. So the language, and I use it in a very broad sense, either visual or, let's say, lexicographical, is actually a basic instrument in order to grasp the alterity, to connect these words. And thinking in terms of, more in terms of the, let's say, methodological approaches, is first of all, of course, it's the very strong interdisciplinarity, which is, I think, one of the most striking and particularly interesting aspects of all the paper this afternoon, how to engage and combine several sources, but also how to apply new research trends, methodological trends to the research. For example, the idea of emotional communities. And as a medievalist, I've been working with Rosenbein for a very long time. So the idea of creating these emotional communities, these emotional scripts, and also the way, which also strikes me, how, and forgive me if I'm wrong, it could also be a question to all of you, how all this seemingly spontaneous action are actually very much the result of a mastermind. How much of these scripts, of these emotions, are actually scripted and organized, you know, in a kind of approach where nothing seems to be left to chance. Nothing happens by chance, and everything seems to be, you know, somehow organized in order to be able to cope with these new words. You could also say to control, to grasp them, and also to a certain extent also have to say to control them. So that's at least what I have to say. And to conclude this very brief introduction, I hope I could grasp some of the idea is what Angelo said about the importance of seeing the whole picture. So ideally, you know, all the approaches that you have so wonderfully explained and put in practice this afternoon, the possibility, and I think it's good to organize the webinars to put them together, to have this, well, say, holistic way to approach this cross-cultural interaction, and also the importance to see this cross-cultural interaction really as cross-cultural. So not only studying sources which were produced in Europe by European, but also taking into account how much of the knowledge we're actually still drawing on in our, let's say, Western world is actually being produced outside Europe, and how much, you know, let's say, a fully understanding the importance, let's say, of our pre-modern and also, I would say, modern words comes from the awareness that cultural production is something that it is, I would say, global in essence, and acknowledging this globality and this multiformity and this multidisciplinarity actually is as the very basis of understanding, let's say, cultures and exchange, and of course of understanding knowledge, and how knowledge is being produced, transmitted, and transformed across space, places, and time. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sabrina, for this effort of drawing lines, linking or connecting papers that shared some, at least in part, methodological approaches, and probably also a kind of shared emotions with respect to the sources we have been approaching in order to design these research paths, and also for pointing out somehow the desire of trying to keep together in a synoptical picture this variety of approaches that share, and this it's something I agree with you strongly. I agree with you. Are let's say outside of Europe. They all emerged, or they were all designed. I'm talking specifically about the sources themselves and the experiences that are mirrored by or through the sources, are involving European agents for sure, but and not only, not as we have seen in the beautiful images displayed by Alexandra Curvelo, for instance, or the debates on barbarism in Chinese text analyzed by Anna, or in the way emotions draw the action of missionaries in missionary context in the East, in the paper delivered by Linda. So thanks for helping in analyzing or providing kind of meta-analysis of the direct analysis presented. And now there is still some time for our guests, if they wish, to ask questions, share their comments, if any, and they could either do this by writing on the chat. Claudia Firino and Giovanni Sini, together with myself, we will try to provide a kind of order if any order will be requested, and or speaking up, showing up through your video and the microphone if you like so. So please feel free to enter any, to share any question, comments, critiques, whatever.
Angelo?
Prego.
May I start with a question?
Please.
A question I always wanted to ask you, but never dared to, and now it's time. No, thank you to all. I mean, I'm starting from your research because possibly it's the one I know best. So. Now, I was wondering about, in all your presentation is, and I apologize for not knowing that, the Portuguese play a very important role, especially in this, let's say, lingua franca and this translation process of translation, lexicographical knowledge. I was wondering, what about Spanish? And I apologize if it is a very, very dumb question. Let me just take it for someone very far away. I mean, why Portuguese? I mean, it's a matter of research. It's a matter of intrinsic difference in the way that it was performed, with Spanish and other, let's say, European languages. Or is there something specific to the way that these, let's say, Portuguese, let's say, global contacts were performed?
Well, thanks for the question. It's a fundamental question, and it's a very difficult question. Sure, Portuguese was the translational language for the spaces encompassed within the two meridians or lines of Tordesillas, moving east towards the Zaragoza line, established in 1529. And on the other side, there was the Spanish Empire, with a clearly different dynamic, political and military dynamic. In order to I'm fully aware that I'm oversimplifying, but in the context of the Spanish Empire in the New World, there was the conquest, a territorial conquest. Nevertheless, through this territorial conquest, the territorial conquest implied also the imposition of the language companion of the empire following Nebrija and others. Nevertheless, there were very strong language or linguistic dynamics going on, in particular, or at first in Mexico, and later in Peru, involving similar practices or even pioneering. So before the language dynamics going on through Portuguese in the space of both the Estado da India, the State of India, or the Padroado, the royal patronage of Portugal. We are talking about at least, let me put it this way. In the American continent, there was an enormous plurality of languages with some major linguistic groups within the different political or so to speak states, pre-Columbian states or pre-Spanish states. They were the object of translational efforts, but in a context in which the Spanish managed or started a deep and, so to speak, successful territorial conquest. This was not the case, or let's say with some exceptions, this was not the case with the Portuguese presence in, let's say, in Asia, with the exception of Brazil, which is, of course, in the American continent. For the rest, there was a limited territorial conquest. And most of the languages the Portuguese entered, or most of the languages that were translated through the Portuguese language were not languages that belonged to places that were conquered by the Portuguese, or there were even places where the Portuguese did not arrive. For instance, in China. As you know, the Portuguese only had a trade spot in Macau. Nevertheless, Portuguese was used not necessarily by Portuguese people, but in the case, as you have seen in the case of the dictionary, by Italian missionaries in order to try to translate the Chinese language. So in order, I would stop here, but trying to oversimplify, Spanish was very important for the translation of American languages in the same manner, but in a totally different political context. I mean, the context of conquest in South America, a context of conquest, but not as territorial as the territorial conquest developed by the Spanish. It is a kind of, these are two very different kind of framework. But probably, I mean, the colleague Anna Carolina Hosne could add to this, given her very specific expertise on both sides. I mean, in the Chinese missionary context and the Peruvian missionary context. So please, yeah. Anna, if you wish to.
No, well, I mean, I agree on your with what you just said. But what I noticed through time is a difference in the training. I mean, if you compare the Spanish patronato and the Portuguese padroado, the training, in this case for missionaries who would compose these dictionaries, training was not the same. It seems that, I mean, the Portuguese, the training was really, it was scheduled before going to China. They would stop in Macau, they would train there. They were preparing material for the missionaries in Macau. And when you compare the missionaries who arrived in Spanish America, New Spain, Mexico may be different, but I mean, modern South America, you don't see this. They would arrive, and some of them would really try to train in the local languages. But if you take, for instance, José de Acosta, who's one of the most well-known Jesuits in the Virreinato de Peru Viceroyalty, he could hardly speak Aymara or Quechua, and he spent many years there. So then you find Jesuits, maybe low-key Jesuits, not like Acosta, who really master the local languages. But what I noticed that the training before arrival, actually, that was different in these two parts of the world. I don't know if I kind of answered the question.
It's an insightful point, I think. It's a very insightful point. Thank you. I see that the colleague Eva Schalbroek would like to ask a question or to share a comment. So please, Eva.
Yes, a question. Thank you very much. Maybe just a short, I work at Utrecht University on Belgian colonialism and missionaries in Central Africa. And I sort of want to pick up on the comment on interdisciplinarity, because if I understood correctly, all of the speakers sort of mainly identify as historians, but do sort of work on, or historians, art historians, but work on other disciplines as well. And I feel like, especially, you know, that recently everyone has the ambition to study, to do interdisciplinary work, but it's, you know, in practice, it's not always that easy, especially because disciplines have different ideas of power and knowledge. And I'm finding that as someone studying history of colonialism, history of missionaries, and then looking into what post-colonial scholars are doing, having a very different idea of what power and knowledge, you know, here we are talking about intercultural encounter. And then if we sort of look at sort of post-colonial scholars working on similar figures, similar topics, coming to completely different conclusions. And then I find myself struggling, like, how do I sort of marry those two completely different insights we often get when working with different disciplines? And so it was mainly a comment and a general question for speakers. How do you find yourself straddling those different disciplines, especially when they have very diverging ideas about power, knowledge, and culture? So,
who would like to comment or to follow Eva's very very important, I think, and I think that whoever has been trying to do interdisciplinary work, or in teams, or just individually, is facing the kind of difficulties or challenges, maybe better highlighted by Eva. Alexandra, would you like to, as an art historian, in fact, maybe working on Japanese sources, for instance, from also a European perspective, could you say, could you share some of your vast experiences in facing this kind of challenges or opportunities as well?
Well, I will try to answer briefly because I cannot take so much time, but what I can say is obviously based on my own experience. So as Angelo already said, I'm an art historian. That means that my master and PhD degrees were within the field of art history, but my base is history. And I also had, I was fortunate enough to work for many years in museums. So I worked in the National Art Museum in Lisbon and the National Azulejo Tile Museum in Lisbon, as well as in the Portuguese Institute for Conservation and Restoration of objects and not movable, but also, for instance, mural painting. So that gave me really this insight, and more than an insight, this perception of how important it is, at least it is for me, and I think for any art historian, to work and to know how to work with documents, textual written documents, printed manuscripts, so on and so on, but also with objects and images, because they require a different approach. You cannot work on objects by looking at photographs. You really need to interact with the objects and images, and to know how to do this. And much of this came not from the time I was in the university, but came from the experience of working in museums and with colleagues from conservation and restoration. And in fact, some of my colleagues and some of the people with whom I work with today are conservators. So they have really, this is a complementary, view, insight of the material I study. So I think that this is quite important. And another thing that I can tell you is that when I decided to work on number art, we are talking about, when you talk about a number art, but I could say this for China or for other missions, we are talking about, you know, accomplishments and material that belong to different cultures. So number is as much about European references as it is about Japanese references. I knew nothing about this. So I really felt the need to go to Japan to, you know, to have this insight into Japanese art. Visiting, I went to Sophia Daigaku in Tokyo, and to know the collections and to be able to, again, to see and to really directly observe and, if possible, to touch some of these objects, and having some of these interlocutors that I already mentioned. Very briefly, Eva, but I totally agree and understand your point.
Is there anybody else who would like to either follow or raise this line of discussion, or would like to introduce other topics?
I'm sorry, Angelo. Ah, sì, ci sarebbe, esatto, Evi Volgaracchi che ha alzato la mano.
Please.
Yeah, I have a
Perfect.
It's okay. And let me put down lower my hand. Okay, I'm a missiologist from Greece. I teach at the University of Athens, missiology and interfaith dialogue. So when one tries to work cross-disciplinary, sometimes brings something very, very interesting out. A new insight, but sometimes ends up in disappointing all his colleagues in all disciplines he tries to bring somewhat together. Nevertheless, I was also very intrigued by your persistence in that not just that also people who work in religious studies who study these topics. And I would like to thank you because I've been working on Cyril and Methodius and their work in the 9th century and Glagolitic script and then Cyrillic script. And what you said about missionary linguistics was something new to me and brought a new insight. So I took very, very many notes here. And really, I would like to thank you. I have a question for you, if you can tell me anything about Portuguese in Ethiopia, if there was some interaction with local language, especially in the period where Arabs invaded Ethiopia and then again they were sent away. And I would like also to maybe in an email to Alexandra Curvelo. This is a piece of literature in Greek, which is very interesting. It is written by the Orthodox Metropolitan of Korea, Ambrosios Zographos, similarities in iconography between Christ and Buddha. And because it has a missiological background, this might interest you. Although, well, there are also pictures in the book. But it's good to know. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
If well, Ethiopia was for sure a central, how to say, landmark for missionaries, for missionary activities, and also the imaginary. At the moment, I cannot tell you anything more specific on the learning of the languages, not for sure through the Portuguese, because the documents that come to my mind are mostly written in Latin. But I would note down this, and if we could exchange, let's say, emails or something like that, it for sure, it's a central element, because Ethiopia, I mean, since antiquity and the Middle Ages, was a crucial land spot or landmark in the global, let's say, or ecumenical Christianity. Thank you so much. Are there
can I just add something? Sorry, Angelo.
Oh, please, Alexandra.
Okay, I can write to Evie if I may. Ethiopia is not at all, of course, my field of study, but I know that the Spanish Jesuit Pedro Paes, who was there in the first decades of the 17th century, and who played really a key role within the mission, the Christian mission in Ethiopia. I think that he learned, or at least he was involved in translations to Ge'ez. So I will try to send you some information about this. Okay?
I would like to make a point with you, to share a thought with you. As most of the people, or in this webinar, we have been undergoing years and years of training at school, from primary school to secondary school to the university, the PhD, the master, whatever. And of course, we used textbooks, history textbooks, and the analysis of textbooks is one important line of research in the ReIReS community of my research center, ISEM-CNR. And we focused on the way religious studies are developed or dealt with in textbooks, secondary schools textbook in particular, and university textbooks. But I would like to share this comment with you. I was trained in Italy, and I took my degree in Italy. And in the textbook of history I've used, there was not even a single line on any one of the topics that today we have been discussing with Alexandra, Curvelo, Carolina Hosne, Lindia Zampol Dortia, and Sabrina. Not even a line. I didn't know at all that the existence of Namban object. I didn't know that, Namban screens that Alexandra displays are depicted by Japanese painters representing in an ideal form, it's another discussion, groups of European merchants and missionaries arriving in Japan. Imagine if in this mid-15th century, a group of Chinese or Japanese people came to Rome, started to build church, printing dictionaries of Latin, in translating them into Japanese, or making enormous depictions. Because these Namban screens, I'm lucky enough to be given the opportunity with Alexandra to visit many museums and temples in Japan, where we saw a lot of these screens. These are enormous, gigantic objects. Or imagine, is in the case of Anna, or as Anna and Linda explained to us, imagine if you have groups of Confucian literati arriving in Rome and doing all they could in order not to be named barbarian by the Pope. And do all these kind of stories would be out of European textbooks? So I am totally, even today I have on my, you cannot see it because of the fake screen. I have tenors of textbooks, and none of European textbooks. And none of these stories are even slightly reported. I mean, I don't know what conclusions to drive or to draw from this, but this is something that all of you can easily check in the books, in the textbooks, history textbooks you have on your desk. And it's something to me very problematic, because these are, these are not really minor events. The corpora we are presenting are, unfortunately, extremely disregarded in European-based fields of studies, whether religious or cultural. The things are changing, but at least not in textbooks. There is a lot of inertia. I'm aware of these things that, but it's something I wanted to share with you, and because this is, in fact, one of the reasons that brought me to organize and to keep reflecting and sharing this through also this webinar. I don't know what is your opinion or your feelings or emotions about this, but
I would say it's also our responsibility to make things change. And that's why it's important. I mean, you know, because you can always complain about what others are not being doing, but it's also our responsibility. And I think we as historians, especially if you are given this opportunity, how important it is to, let's say, in order to promote these ideas, and also to, let's say, get out of our ivory towers and try to explain to a broader public what happens and what is at stake here. And of course, I mean, textbooks are very conservative. They are everywhere, even in the low countries, of especially the low countries, I don't know. But I think that I'm aware also of the responsibility that we all have in our privileged position to promote these ideas to a broader public. And especially, I would say, if you have such wonderful materials as the material being showing this afternoon, because this is the way, you know, the visuality, this is the way to broaden up the horizon, not just of our own horizon, but more the horizon of the general public. Because these are, especially the sources that have been shown, are the sources actually doing the trick, because they are intriguing, because they are, of course, wonderful, because they challenge our ideas about what is important in history and where actually history, where big events of history have taken place. So I have to say that, and especially I would say, and that's why I think that this network is very important, to train our students in this topic, you know, because it's not just a textbook. A textbook are written by people attending our history courses of art history, of linguistics. And so these are the future writers of these books. So to make these disciplines actually be at the very core of our university curriculum. And then come back to this point, because they're multidisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, it's more and more. There's also, I would say, well, now in the Netherlands, now we have this new feature of decolonize the curriculum. I wouldn't take a too political position for you, but it's something which is really happening. And I think something that should be a kind of natural translations of what we're been discussing with each other this afternoon. So in order to better train our students and to let's say, change their perspectives, and to see how important it is to really to enlarge the way that we consider history, the way we treat our sources. And also, I would say also that the set of sources that we've been using can be significantly expanding, including all the sources that you've been discussing this afternoon. So I think that this webinar would be should be translated into a kind of impact action in order to put this this topic and these approaches at in the attention of our let's say university and also our educational systems.
Thank you, Sabrina. Is there anybody who want or wish to add comments or ideas?
If I may add a word about this.
Please, please.
First of all, I would like to say that I really appreciated all the speakers, all the presentation. Really, I really was surprised for the richness of the ideas being presented today. But I would like to say a word about what Sabrina was saying now, because I strongly agree with her. I think that in some way we have a part of responsibility in this process, in the sense that every one of us does his research, but when is the moment to apply for a project, to make the proposal for a course to a university department, there is always a strong pressure toward conservative choices. And in some way, we are, I say we, because now I'm part of a research center as CNR, as National Council for Researchers. We have maybe more degrees of freedom in this sense, but I think we have to fight for this. As my colleagues of the ISEM knows, in a few time we will have a new dean for the Department of Human Science. And I want to, as one of the first things I would like to speak with her or him, is exactly this, to open a new area of research exactly inspired by the contents of the seminar of today. And I'm not sure that will be easy to be accepted as a proposal, but if we don't try, we will never know. So thank you very much, Sabrina, to stress this point that I think is particularly important. And thank you very much to all the speakers of this afternoon.
Well, thank you. I think on behalf of everybody involved. And is there any other question, remarks, or curiosity left that you would like to pursue? And maybe it's late and we are all a bit tired, and so maybe it's time to say goodbye, and I hope we could pursue and develop further some of the ideas, or the small community that got together this afternoon. And it's my pleasure to thank again the four speakers, to thank again Claudia Firino, my colleagues and friends, Claudia Firino, Giovanni Sini, my director, Professor Gaetano Sabatini, and all of you to have gathered with us and to have stimulated these presentations and the analysis we have been developing together. I'm grateful again to the research infrastructure on religious studies, which was in fact the framework inside which this webinar was made possible. And I invite all of you to, if you're not familiar with the project, to look at their website. It's quite rich and it's quite articulated, and we hope it could be developed further. So thank you again, and enjoy a wonderful evening and a nice weekend. And thank you for being with us this afternoon again.